The lid of the linen cupboard creaks. Hand-sewn sheets are laid out like an inventory of future life. And between the linen lies a thin sheet of parchment with a seal, a promise that damage to one's reputation can be exchanged for money. The room smells of hot wax and irons. Seamstresses are busy nearby. Bells are ringing in the evening outside, and every sound reminds us that a stranger's gaze is worth more than any silver here. The paper is placed in the dowry chest like a talisman, and the door closes quietly. The sticky silence of insurance is stronger than any lock. A male voiceover greeted the audience, noting that he was glad to see everyone watching, asking which cities and countries they had come from to hear this story, asking them to leave comments about it, and wished them a careful and unhurried viewing. Ahead lies a story of how concern for honor turned into a lucrative industry, where every word was measured in coins and fear. The city lived by two standards. On the outside, order, posted statutes, and stamp duties. On the inside, invisible markets of hopes and fears. At the end of the 16th century, under Emperor Rudolph II, in a wealthy imperial city, where pious merchants argued over the prices of cloth and copper, a fashionable service for the bourgeoisie appeared, sheets promising compensation in the event of a disgraced marriage. The formula sounded calm and legal, an insurance policy in case of a dispute over the bride's chastity and subsequent loss of reputation, with payment of an agreed amount if the union was deemed damaging to the family's honor. The certificates were issued by an intermediary who called himself a broker, an elderly man in clean cuffs and a fine German suit, with an office above a copyist's shop, a stone's throw from the town hall. He had an exemplary register of seals, notebooks with neat lines of contributions, and on the wall, copies of quotations from treatises on virtue and order, copied in beautiful handwriting to give the paper the appearance of a moral shield. The scheme seemed simple. The groom's family and the bride's family, both adult parties who had reached the age of majority under city law, made regular contributions, with the bride's family paying more often in the hope of protecting their good name from possible gossip. In the event of a failed marriage of honor, as the event was formulated, the policy promised to compensate for the costs of the dowry, wedding expenses, and the cost of certain gifts. To avoid accusations of gambling and usury, the policy was not called life or body insurance, but a contract for compensation for moral damage, and was accompanied by a list of conditions under which damage was recognized as proven. The list was striking in its pedantry and coldness. It required the conclusion of experts, a surgeon, a midwife, and a church scholar, as well as 2 testimonials of good reputation before the wedding, and an entry in the city register, stating that the quarrel between the families was public in nature. At the bottom were small nails of reservations, exceptions, footnotes, terms that could be interpreted in almost any way. Each line pushed one thought. Without the experts from the broker's list, the event would not be recognized as having occurred. People bought the policy willingly. The service was discussed over sweet wine in houses where northern carpets and crucifixes in heavy carved frames hung on the walls. Fathers who ran shops and warehouses called the sheet wise foresight. Mothers clasped their fingers in rosaries and said that paper was stronger than rumors. Notaries stamped their seals, the city treasury received its fees, and no one minced words. The fear of the natural judgment of the crowd was stronger than ropes and statutes. The legend that financial paper could stop public humiliation seemed convenient, like a keyhole with a key. It was believed that if a neighbor's gossip turned into market noise, the document would become a barrier that no slander could pass through. But the myth was drowned out by another kind of paper. The magistrate's archives contained penalty books, regulations from bathhouses and doctors, and rules from church consistories. They clearly stated that attempts to turn a dispute over reputation into a bargaining chip were condemned as a substitute for justice. The documents stipulated that conflicts of honor should be resolved through testimony and oaths, not by private individuals selling verification of the truth. The Guild of Surgeons and Midwives regularly reminded people that physical signs were not an immutable seal, and medical treatises, from Italian to French, referring to the experience of practitioners, noted how unreliable any natural evidence was. These sheets were less appealing. They did not promise a peaceful night in exchange for money. The town clerk, an elderly man accustomed to listening to the rustling of parchment as a game of chance played by the rich, turned to the subject for the first time because of the numbers, or rather because of their stubborn silence. In the revenue book of stamp duties, he noticed that the sheets on the restoration of honor were stamped more often than the trade contracts of small shops. There were more of them during the marriage season, closer to winter, and in the spring, when the trade routes opened. He pulled out copies of the contracts and saw a strange regularity. Out of hundreds of policies issued, not a single case was marked as fully compensated. The reports listed small payments, referred to as consolation payments, and long phrases about insufficient evidence. The clerk compiled a list of cases where families, being adults and legally competent, tried to obtain the promised amount, and began to compare the names of the experts with the guild lists. It turned out that the experts were almost always the same: two surgeons without master status, several midwives whose names were not in the book of oaths, and a man from a theological school who did not have a clerical title. Sometimes the contract mentioned others, but in reality the conclusion came from the same people. The clerk noted the addresses and found coincidences. The master experts rented rooms from people who paid taxes on property on the same street where the broker's office kept its paper warehouse. And one of the surgeons was listed as a guarantor on a private promissory note issued to the owner of the office. Formally, everything looked legal. The city knew that private obligations and guarantees were commonplace. But taken together, it painted a simple picture. The experts were included in the economic funnel of the scheme itself. At the same time, there was another layer that did not appear in the income books: human suffering. The consistory's records noted quarrels between adult spouses, where family relatives pushed them into humiliating examinations, trying, as they thought, to strengthen their position in case of a dispute. Medical records casually noted examinations at the insistence of the groom's family and unwarranted interventions, which city surgeons, bound by an oath not to cause harm, complained about. Midwives, acting according to the rules, avoided such assignments, but those who refused were replaced by others who willingly signed the necessary papers for cash. This was the cold arithmetic of the market. The more shameful the situation, the more expensive the certificate, and the easier it was to deny the occurrence of the insured event by declaring it unconfirmed. To maintain buyer confidence, the broker used a network of small legends. Stories circulated from house to house that the payment had helped a particular family to silence their neighbors, that in one parish the policy had saved the dowry from the greedy relatives of the groom, that the magistrate had approved the scheme indirectly, since he was collecting stamp duty. These stories fit into the familiar pattern of city life, where prosperity was measured not only by the weight of coins, but also by the density of silence surrounding a family name. But when the clerk sorted the cases by year, he saw that in every case referred to as successful, the payments were either pennies or hung on endless further examination. The myth of the financial shield stood on the shaky foundation of a paper quagmire. The broker's office resembled a tiny museum of trust. On the windowsills were wax seals. On the walls were painted boards with excerpts from city rules on good manners, and on the table were rows of contracts, at the bottom of which phrases about conditions and exceptions were endlessly repeated in small handwriting. According to them, the event for which the sheet was purchased might never happen. Any attempt to rely on physical evidence was met with a reservation about inappropriate examination. Any reference to witnesses was met with a reference to undue interest. And if the dispute reached the magistrate, the broker's representatives brought the guild statutes, and referring to them, claimed that the persons who participated in the examination did not have full authority. Thus, the document that promised a fair outcome itself became an instrument of endless delay. The legal framework of the transaction was built on a fine line between insurance and gambling. Ecclesiastical courts had long condemned contingency contracts as a form of gambling when human life and dignity were at stake. City lawyers, not wanting to spoil relations with wealthy families, insisted that this was merely a private agreement between the parties on compensation, as is done in the case of commercial risks. But commercial risk was measured by weights, logs, and weather. A dispute over honor was measured by a fog of words and pain. Where a merchant could present a broken barrel or a letter from the port, here they brought traumatic conclusions, and each such letter tore at the living. Thus, the economy of the body became part of the city budget. The clerk looked at the bigger picture. He compared quarterly reports on marriages, notaries' records of dowries, and deeds of family disputes. The peak months for policy sales coincided with periods of religious tension and intensified preaching about discipline, when reminders about order in the home and strength of morals were heard from the pulpits. The harsher the tone of the sermons, the more often people bought paper out of fear of public shame. During the same seasons, goods for household cleanliness were more actively sold in the markets, and additional announcements about the rules of decency appeared in the bathhouse regulations. The system was self-sustaining. Religious pressure created demand. Demand fed the broker, and the broker justified himself with quotations from the same sermons. Private letters, accidentally intercepted and ending up in the archives with inheritance cases, were accompanied by descriptions of family scenes. Adult women reported to their aunts that the letter is with us in the chest and father is calm, while adult men reassured their business partners that everything is in order and no talk will do any harm. These phrases were written in a state of panic. Fear of rumors became part of estate planning, and in this panic, it was easiest to sell something that could not be verified, a promise that unknown experts would confirm something that medicine had never guaranteed. Medical books, rewritten in German and Latin, noted that the external physical sign of chastity is not permanent and that any examination can cause harm. But the healing mind lost out to commercial calculation. The turning point came from a trifle. The clerk noticed that in several cases, the signature of the theological advisor was barely distinguishable and was written by the same hand as some of the official notes on the broker's forms. He took out the ink master registers and compared the lines. In the city, such comparisons were made to verify wills and promissory notes. The similarity of the handwriting was not 100% proof, but it looked like an alarm bell. It later emerged that one of the expert surgeons also worked as a clerk for the night watchman, dealing with fines, a lowly position, but an important one for monitoring bathhouses and brothels, and could influence how any incident involving insult to honor was classified. It turned out that the chain was closed, from the expert to the guards, from the guards to the city records, from the records to the proven event, and from there back to the contract, which never had complete confirmation. When the bride's adult relatives tried to get full payment in one of the houses, the broker responded with threats of libel suits. Letters from his office, written in a dry and confident tone, reminded them that the policy was a private agreement, and that spreading information about the insolvency of the product in itself undermines order and incites unrest. A new zone of silence arose around the names that had recently been heard in the markets in connection with fragrant spices and fine fabrics. Those who had paid premiums preferred not to mention the failure so as not to expose their own family names. And so the silence grew, with no one receiving what had been promised in full. Here, the myth finally diverged from the document. The myth said that insurance paper would protect honor as confidently as a lock protects a chest. The document, the statutes of medical guilds, consistory protocols, and guard penalty books, showed how exactly an insurable event became uninsurable, unprovable without harm, dependent on opinions and conflicts, replaced by references from people on the seller's payroll. The clerk drew up a note to the magistrate asking him to check the scheme for fraud, but he understood that it would vanish into thin air, where every large family preferred not to see it. After all, the stamp duty had already been paid, which meant that the paper seemed to serve the city. And yet, at the end of a long week, he compiled a dossier. On the first page were lists of experts with addresses and witnesses to their dependencies. On the second was a table comparing contracts and their outcomes, where the line about insufficient evidence was repeated with frightening regularity. On the third were excerpts from medical regulations emphasizing the inadmissibility of traumatic examinations and the dubiousness of physical signs. In a separate folder were letters from adult women complaining of pressure from their fiancés' families and notes from treating surgeons warning of the dangers. All documents were written without direct quotations, in a respectful but firm tone, as required by the city office. At this point, the story took another prepared turn. The city guard's registry contained an order stating that night inspections in bathhouses had to be coordinated with one of those very experts. The order was issued during the season when policy sales peaked and was signed by the deputy captain of the guard, whose wife was a cousin of a distant relative of the broker. Such a connection did not prove a crime, but it showed how the legend of public benefit drove the mechanisms of power, and how these mechanisms, in turn, protected the paper that promised protection, where the law saw only human dignity and a prohibition on causing harm. The clerk realized that he had not just a set of papers, but a whole picture of a market that feeds on fear. He could not describe it with loud words or appeal to pity. His weapons were registers, statutes, and lines of ink. He gathered the signatures of 2 guild elders, a surgeon and a senior midwife, both respected figures with oaths and authority, who agreed to confirm the common medical truth about the unreliability of physical evidence. He added excerpts from consistorial rules prohibiting humiliating examinations, and noted that insurance policies actually encouraged such practices by making suffering a criterion for payment. The paper that promised protection brought pain. All that remained was to take the step to the magistrate, but the clerk understood that his note would be followed by threats. The broker had already hinted that any attempt at exposure would be called an offense and interference in private contracts of good houses. Behind him stood the habit of rich women to believe in paper more than in statutes, and the silence of those who had long understood: the louder the cry, the higher the price of shame. But behind the clerk were the lines of city laws, and from these lines a simple truth emerged. Insuring the uninsurable is not a concern, but speculation on pain. Next came a confrontation with those who built their business on this pain, and those who remained silent for the sake of peace in half the neighborhood. He picked up the folder, tightened the strap on the cover, and headed for the place where, according to its own legend, the city put an end to things, to the magistrate's desk, who was obliged to compare the myth with the document and decide what weighed more in this city: the stamp duty on false peace of mind, or the right of adults not to be commodities on the insurance market of shame. The walk to the town hall didn't take long, but every window along the way seemed to the clerk like a small showcase of the local faith in paper armor. In the workshops, the scissors of tailors rustled as they prepared outfits for autumn weddings. In the shops, spice merchants whispered about new collections of moral instructions. In the bathhouses, crossed-out notices hung on the doors prohibiting any unauthorized inspections, and on the steps of the cathedral, deacons recorded donations, where a measure of piety was always accompanied by a measure of anxiety. The broker's office, lurking above the copyist, remained nearby, like a shadow from the town hall tower, falling on the neighboring courtyard. The clerk entered the office and, without allowing himself a single unnecessary gesture, placed the folder on the table of the magistrate's secretary on duty, noting that the materials related to private contracts, which essentially replaced the judicial assessment of cases of honor, and thus affected the rights of the city. So the folder was given an incoming number and went on its way, first to the civil litigation judge, then to the city lawyer, then to the guild elders of surgeons and midwives, whose oaths served as a kind of sanitary charter in the city, not subject to arbitrary interpretation. The city lawyer was the first to respond. He did not dispute that the subject matter of the contracts was slippery, but reminded everyone, as was often the case with later emperors, that a private agreement between adult parties was not in itself criminal, as long as it did not violate any prohibitions. The lawyer recommended gathering evidence of actual harm and systematic non-payment, as well as comparing the composition of the experts with the register of people authorized to give opinions on physical condition. The clerk did this in advance and filed the very same table of coincidences in a folder, the same core of names, the same neighboring addresses, the same mutual guarantees on promissory notes. To this table he added an excerpt from the imperial police regulations of the former sovereign, which condemned gambling on future random events if they concerned dignity and the body. The lawyer read it and made a note that, although the broker's sheet was formally called a compensation agreement rather than an insurance policy, its structure replicated the prohibited model of betting on honor, with a pre-established mechanism for refusing to recognize the event as having occurred. Next, 2 workshop elders were invited to the case, a surgeon and a midwife, authoritative adults who had taken oaths according to the statutes. They brought their books and deemed it necessary to remind everyone of the obvious. No physical sign can serve as universal or reliable confirmation that the parties to a marriage are telling the truth or lying. Any attempt to turn the body into evidence measured by the presence or absence of a mark, leads to trauma, shameful scenes, and abuse that undermine both medicine and order. The elders also presented a list of complaints, which included attempts by the groom's relatives to push through an examination through acquaintances among the guards, which was contrary to the rules of procedure. All this confirmed the main thesis of the clerk's note. It is not protection that is being sold, but the opportunity to endlessly delay recognition of the event, making payment itself impossible. At this point, the broker tried to preempt the blow. He sent a neatly bound brochure to the office in which he boasted about the benefits of the sheets for public peace. According to him, the policies supposedly reduced the likelihood of public scandals because both parties, being adults and legally competent, knew in advance that the dispute would be settled by experts. At the end of the brochure were excerpts from sermons calling for order in the home and 3 brief lists of happy resolutions, each without names, dates, or amounts. Upon closer inspection, it turned out that these stories coincided with cases where, according to the clerk's table, payments had been reduced to negligible consolation amounts, and lengthy correspondence had replaced meaning. The broker relied on legend and discarded the document as unnecessary baggage. The next step was for the magistrate to order a closed hearing without unnecessary publicity, so as not to flood the city with gossip. On one side of the table sat representatives of the guild statutes, on the other, the broker's attorneys. The clerk sat next to the city lawyer, quietly bringing up each point based on archival documents. The hearing proceeded in a restrained manner, as required by protocol. Some presented statutes, others presented private contracts, and the city had to decide where the line between care and trading on uncertainty lay. Once again, the expert's ties to the broker's office came to light, and this time the attorneys explained it away as a natural professional closeness that would surprise no one in the city. But when they were asked to name at least one case of full payment and present the amounts, no one could specify the year, family, and amount of compensation that could be verified with the stamp books. This silence was heavier than any indictment. At the same time, the clerk conducted another check, essentially a historical and economic analysis, which he did not arrive at immediately, but through the stubbornness of the numbers. He took the annual reports on dowries, where notaries recorded how much fabric, coins, and household items were transferred to the new family. Then he compared them with the insurance premium columns, neatly broken down by quarter. The result was a curve where any increase in religious pressure on moral purity was almost immediately reflected in an increase in policy sales. Conversely, periods when the magistrate was busy with water supply, roads, and grain warehouses led to a decline in demand for paper security. This graph could not be presented as a law, but it showed how fear and infrastructure play on different fields. The former feeds private individuals, the latter feeds the city. At the second meeting, the broker went on the offensive. His attorneys claimed an encroachment on the private autonomy of the houses and reminded everyone that the city had already collected a stamp duty on each transaction, thereby recognizing their de facto legality. The lawyer responded by referring to previous imperial decrees and local statutes. A fee on paper does not yet constitute recognition of its meaning. The stamp only confirms the fact of the transaction, but does not exempt from responsibility for its content. Then the attorneys tried to make the case look like slander against good people, threatening a series of lawsuits against those who signed the conclusions about the harmfulness of the practice. Words about courts and discredited reputations rose like a winter wind from the river, but each gust was broken by carefully constructed references. The ban on traumatic examinations, the inadmissibility of betting on physical conditions, the guild rules, which the broker called wise pillars of order in his brochure, but from which he extracted only the lines that were convenient for him. In order not to leave any loopholes, the clerk obtained another type of document, an act of verification of handwriting skills, which was used in disputes over wills. He provided the case with comparative tables of the lines of the theological advisor and the internal clerk of the broker's office. The handwriting expert pointed out that the similarities were significant, although they did not provide absolute certainty. But for the city court, the high probability that the conclusions depended on the seller was sufficient. Coupled with the discovered promissory notes, this reinforced the overall picture. The experts were not independent. At the hearing, this did not sound like a sensation, but rather like the final dot on the letter, which had been painstakingly drawn out over a long period of time. Meanwhile, rumors were spreading throughout the city. In church, women discussed how families they knew were trying to tear up the purchased sheet so as not to remember it. Shopkeepers whispered that the broker was thinking of moving his office to a neighboring town where the magistrate was lazier. Young craftsmen laughed that the stamp on the paper muddied the waters worse than a tavern on a rainy evening. All this market chatter reached the town hall and knocked on the doors of the council chamber, reminding everyone that the decision would be not only legal, but also moral and economic. Abolishing the sheets would strike a blow against the rich's habit of buying silence, while keeping them would legitimize the transformation of the body into an object of dubious value. To finally separate myth from document, the clerk insisted on an audit of the register of baths and night inspections. There were orders where an expert from the broker's circle was given the right to be present during raids to prevent violations of decency. The meaning of such a privilege was clear. Those who draw up conclusions for insurance policies also participate in the formation of the city's chronicle of misconduct, from which it is then convenient to extract the necessary phrases when refusing to pay. The magistrate considered such an order unacceptable, as well as any monopoly on the interpretation of subtle moral matters. The decision on this interim issue stated that night inspections could not be used to obtain dubious evidence in favor of private contracts, and the participation of persons dependent on sellers was prohibited. The broker's response came in the form of several letters to the city office and hints through people close to the guard that a series of counterclaims awaited the whistleblowers. The clerk brought these letters to the case and accompanied them with a neat note. Fear and threats are normal tools of those who sell paper peace, which means that the city sees not a conflict of interpretations, but a systematic attempt to suppress the inspection. He also attached a story from the consistory, where adult spouses managed to get a refusal of a humiliating examination by referring to the statutes of the medical guilds, and noted that such decisions exist, but they are less heard because they are not sold and not posted on the walls. Then the case entered a phase of quiet, tedious arithmetic. The lawyer asked for accurate lists of all the experts' conclusions on the contracts and to check them against the city's books. The broker's liaison brought a folder with lists where some months were mysteriously missing, especially those that coincided with sales peaks. The clerk found rewritten dates and strange repetitions in this sample, after which he added a sheet listing the anomalies to the case: missing quarterly pages, implausibly uniform series of carbon-copied refusals, careful substitution of wording, when unproven events turned into agreement of the parties on additional clarification, even though there was no agreement. Each of these seams revealed the handwriting of an office that knew how to avoid giving answers, prolonging uncertainty until the buyer's will was exhausted. Meanwhile, the autumn marriage season had arrived. The choirs in the cathedral sang of purity of heart, while under the arches of the town hall, people discussed grain prices, roofing felt deliveries, and the size of the next round of duties. These conversations also touched on the lists of honor. Some were going to buy just in case, while others refused after learning about the hearings. The clerk noticed adult women from shopkeeper families approaching him on the street and nodding briefly without saying a word. This was how people in the city thanked him for work that was not customary to talk about. He understood that it was no longer just about finances and legal technicalities. It was about whether statutes and books could overcome the habit of fearing rumors more than trauma and humiliation. It was here that the document had to stand between the individual and the market. The magistrate scheduled a final hearing. 3 stacks of papers lay on the table: statutes, medical rules, and the clerk's tables. On the other side lay the broker's brochure, blank contract forms, and letters threatening legal action. The clerk, an experienced adult, dipped his pen in the inkwell, and a sticky silence fell over the room, similar to that which spreads in rooms where a sheet of paper, with a promise to redeem shame with coins, lies next to the dowry. The clerk went over the pitfalls of the text one last time, the caveats that turned the event into a phantom, the dependencies of the experts who made the conclusion part of a commercial deal, the linking of night checks to private contracts, the non-payments that were replaced by consolatory handouts to save face. He did not demand punishment as such. He asked the city to recognize that insuring the uninsurable is not protection. but a multiplication of pain. The decision had not yet been announced, but a chill had already entered the air, palpable even before the words were spoken. The clerk remembered how it all began: the sheet of paper in the dowry, the smell of wax, the belief that the seal was stronger than the cries of the crowd. He thought that a city where the seal separates false peace from truth would be less beautiful in legends, but more suitable for the lives of adults who do not want their dignity to become the subject of private bets. And as the jurors pored over the papers, he felt that the evidence had taken shape in a way that was hard to miss. A myth promising financial protection of honor, and a document showing how the deal feeds on fog and leaves behind only fear, bills, and trauma. All that remained was to pronounce the words of the decision and let the ink flow across the lines where the city would choose between collecting apparent virtue and the duty to protect its residents from a market that turns gossip into a commodity and pain into an income stream. The decision sounded dry and unadorned, as it does in halls where ink is more important than voices. The magistrate ruled that contracts whose occurrence cannot be confirmed without humiliation, harm, or knowingly dependent conclusions are contrary to city law and customs, and are therefore subject to termination. It was specified that compensation for already purchased sheets must be returned to the contributors, minus stamp duty and reasonable office expenses. That the participation of persons materially dependent on the seller in any certifications is prohibited. That the register of baths and night inspections should be cleared of the privileges of private experts. That the broker's office was obliged to submit a complete list of contracts, contributions, and refusals to pay, with explanations of the reasons within a specified period. The decision contained no proud words about the victory of morality. There were only lines in which the myth collided with the document and broke against it. This break rarely pleases the viewer. Paper tears silently, and habit resists more quietly than a scream. The next day, the city messenger delivered copies to the guild houses, the consistory, and the guards, who were accustomed to seeing such papers as a new kind of tax. The first to respond were the guilds of doctors and midwives. Their statutes confirmed that any examinations at the request of the parties, outside of medical indications, were considered violence against the body and a source of abuse. The consistory reminded everyone that cases of honor in marital disputes are settled with witnesses and oaths, not on the desks of private appraisers. The guards were less enthusiastic. Night raids lost their usual excuse for extra power, but city orders are not discussed aloud. In the shops, they read the decree and tried to understand what return of contributions meant, since the money had long been mixed with family expenses and wrapped in the same cloth as wedding gifts. And in the broker's office there was a silence like the crackling of ice. Everything looks smooth until the first step is taken. The broker responded immediately. Letters poured into the office in which he asserted that the decree distorted the meaning of voluntary private transactions between adults, that the city underestimated his contribution to pacifying morals, and that the return of contributions would destroy trust in any contracts. He offered a compromise: replace the word honor with the neutral family interest, and rewrite the terms so that the event would occur upon the decision of an arbitration council consisting of merchants and two learned men. At first glance, the proposal looked like a concession, but the clerk saw the old skeleton under the new clothes. The unverifiable remained unverifiable. The dependents changed their sign, and the pain became the subject of stock market trading, with the same outcome: eternal postponement. The lawyer carefully returned the papers with a note that the substitution of words did not change the nature of the transaction, and that the Merchants' Arbitration Council could not determine issues involving physical integrity and dignity. Meanwhile, the inventory began. The broker's office was ordered to deliver all books of contributions and statements of refusals to the magistrate. The clerk sat with the registers day after day, checking for coincidences that should not even exist in normal trade. There were conclusions from different experts, signed with the same pen, identical wording of refusals in different families, lists of witnesses whose names were repeated with unusual regularity, as if the city's memory had suddenly narrowed to a few streets. There were periods when sales grew exponentially and then cooled off, as if the office was scooping up demand in waves, adjusting it to the seasons of moral preaching. The tables showed consolation payments equal to the cost of several jugs of wine or fabric for a single sheet, as if the very idea of compensation had been reduced to a gift intended not to console, but to silence the question. Resistance grew in the shadows. Landlords who had a stake in the office through promissory notes tried to persuade the councilors to slow down the implementation of the decision, citing the danger of nervous unrest. In such cases, the city hears not so much words as the clinking of connections, kinship, shared meals, mutual guarantees. But this time, the magistrate had not only moral arguments, but also a stack of papers, guild statutes, imperial police regulations from the time of previous rulers, and consistory rules. They formed a strong front of documents against the myth. Religious authorities, tired of the abuses of inspections, supported the decision, reminding everyone that the doctrine of the dignity of the body is incompatible with turning it into an object of monetary evaluation. Trade leaders weighed the risk of rumors and the risk of precedent and decided to remain silent, because silence is sometimes less dangerous than careless defense. The first applicants for refunds began to arrive. The queue was strange. Adult women in simple house coats and men in better clothes stood side by side, and each had not one but several contracts, some for their daughters, some for their nieces, some for an alliance with their neighbors. The clerk prudently divided the flow: contracts with clear signs of dependence on experts, contracts with consolation payments, contracts without any movement. Each folder required a separate approach. In some cases, 2 signatures and a sum of money were enough, while in others, it was necessary to open old wounds, checking how deeply the paper had interfered in family affairs. The magistrate established a rule: refunds would be made without mentioning the reasons for the purchase, without stirring up family names, without digging into personal matters. The city did not sue people for believing in a convenient lie. The city dealt with those who sold that lie. The broker tried to shift the matter into the shadows. Through his confidants, he spread rumors that the decree was temporary, that the magistrate would soon change his mind, that similar agreements had been accepted with enthusiasm in a neighboring city. He offered the guards help in difficult times, and hinted that, if not insurance, then at least consultation on dispute resolution would remain on the market. In this mosaic, every piece was familiar, an attempt to turn a straight line of prohibition into a blurred line. But the clerk had another card up his sleeve: old correspondence about fictitious arbitration courts, which in previous years had already tried to replace city justice in commercial matters. These papers were taken out of the closet and placed nearby, so that no one would be tempted to pull the rope from the square into a private room again. The returns came in waves. On the first morning it seemed that few would come, as is always the case in matters involving the word shame. But by noon the line stretched along the wall. People held forms with wax seals and stamps that yesterday had looked like protection, but now resembled marks of weakness. The office desks were covered with a jumble of amounts, names, and dates, and in this jumble the clerk adhered to a single rule: count everything, record everything, ask no one for details. In some eyes, there was anger at the city, as if it had violated the secret of family salvation. In others, there was relief that comes when a dangerous thing is finally removed from the house. And between these extremes lay the usual fatigue. People had paid for silence for years, and in return they received a piece of paper whose power disappeared the moment the city announced that insuring the uninsurable was not protection, but a deal with uncertainty. That evening, the clerk returned to the original logic of the case. Why all this had become possible in the first place? He laid out 3 lines on the table. The first was the fear of public evaluation, born of a market of rumors and fueled by seasonal sermons. The second was medical uncertainty, turned into a commodity category by experts without authority. The third was the city's financial hygiene, which failed when the stamp duty accepted any paper without regard to its moral weight. At the intersection of these lines, a brokerage product emerged: peace of mind on credit, redeemed by humiliation. The myth was that this was financial protection of honor, flexible and modern. The document responded that this was insurance of the uninsurable, where premiums exceeded rare consolation payments, and proof of the event required actions prohibited by statutes and common sense. Not wanting to miss the loophole, the broker came up with a new scheme. He proposed issuing not honor policies, but dowry bonds, supposedly secured by goods and collateral, where the events were not physical categories, but reputational costs. The scheme still concealed the same logic. The decisive factor remained the conclusion of the Board of Appraisers, which would include the same people who had changed their sign. After reviewing the papers, the lawyer noted that reputational costs in this form were no better than damage to honor, and were just as invalid. The magistrate added a separate line to the previous decision. Contracts are prohibited where the subject matter is a condition that can only be proven by actions recognized as harmful or humiliating under medical statutes and consistorial rules, or by the conclusions of persons dependent on the seller. This line became a small scar on the city's law, noticeable when you look for it, and a lifeline when you need support. Soon another crack appeared, one that no one liked to talk about aloud. The stamp duty collected on each sheet had long been a familiar source of income. The treasurer muttered that the loss of revenue would require stricter checks on other documents, and the office felt the old temptation come alive, to regulate, not according to justice, but according to convenience. The clerk prepared the figures in advance. He showed that the costs of storing files, reviewing complaints, having guards participate in examinations, and holding conciliation sessions had long exceeded the revenue from stamp duty. That the city, without knowing it, was subsidizing the market of pain. This calculation, devoid of moral theft, had a stronger effect than sermons. Numbers sometimes do what words cannot. They dispel myths without scandal. In the homes where the contributions were returned, a quiet redistribution began. Some families put money in chests, along with updated marriage contracts, where instead of vague guarantees of reputation, specific property conditions and mechanisms for resolving disputes through city justice were now signed. Others bought additional fabrics and dishes, turning imaginary protection into real household items. Still others left part of the sum to donations in parishes, where preachers cautiously supported the purification of customs from bargaining. Only a few had a shadow of resentment on their faces. It seemed to them that the city had taken away their right to buy silence, even if that silence was fake and harmful. Meanwhile, the broker's office was shrinking. The stock of forms lay deadweight, the seals lost their meaning, and bills of exchange had to be paid off from personal funds. People who had brought money in gratitude yesterday now came with receipts and demanded payment. The broker tried to switch to trading in reputation advice and offered to draw up marriage contracts with smart clauses, but the name of his office became a finger pointing at the undesirable. The city rarely remembers the guilty for long, but it likes to remember the tools. And when another shopkeeper raised the issue of tying the future price of fabric to the opinion of respected people, someone in the room coughed and quietly reminded everyone how contracts end when an event cannot be confirmed without causing pain. The clerk did not celebrate his victories. He knew that with the fall of one myth in the city, another would grow in its place. Not about honor, but about health. Not about marriage, but about moral guarantees for apprentices in the workshops. but he saw how a document could prevent a habit from turning into a market. On his desk lay a list of the next vulnerabilities: private oaths, contracts of good conduct for servants, receipts with vows under threat of fines. It was a long road on which it was impossible to put an end to things once and for all. A city, like a body, requires constant hygiene, statutes, checks, and the refusal to give in to the temptation to measure worth in coins. Towards evening, when the candles were extinguished in the town hall, the clerk went out into the square and stopped at the stone bowl of the fountain. The water flowed evenly, like the lines in the registers, where each name is a part of peace. Behind him were the books of refusals, tables of coincidence, threatening letters, neatly filed away. Ahead lay a new season of marriages and a new wave of rumors which the city had learned to meet not with forms, but with clear rules. The myth would once again want to call itself protection, and then the document would have to speak again. Not with a cry, not with a heroic speech, and not with a harsh image, but with a list of simple things. No harm is done to the body. Dignity does not become the subject of a bet, and contracts do not replace the court where it is people, not goods, that are in dispute. The dry part of the work began where viewers usually yawn, but the city lives precisely for this, in the order of execution. The office divided the returns into queues, posted short announcements at the town hall, guild houses, and parishes, instructions on deadlines, where to go, and what documents to bring. The clerk insisted on a simple set of documents: the policy itself, a receipt for payments, the name of the adult holder, without any humiliating questions or curiosity about family conflicts. The guards were told to stand at a distance so that no one would mistake the presence of authority for an implication of guilt. On the very first day, it became clear that the myth was still resisting. Several houses tried to bargain for a partial refund in exchange for silence. A broker's office offered replacement contracts through third parties, and a bricklayer from a neighboring block claimed to have heard that the decree would soon be repealed. All this rained down on the registrars like fine rain on ink, but the lines held. The magistrate's decision left no room for ambiguity. At the same time, the city undertook something that is rarely done without a push. It rewrote the marriage notary forms. The vague formulas about guarantees of honor disappeared, replaced by specific property clauses, shares, items, terms, and the procedure for disputes through the city court and consistory, where witnesses and oaths are more important than hearsay. The elders of the Scribes' Guild reacted cautiously to the changes. For them, it meant learning new forms and forgetting the convenient formula that had been sold as a matter of course for years. But the parishes breathed a sigh of relief. Pastors had long been tired of attempts to turn confession into a platform for bargaining over reputation. And now they had a clear sheet, not for the sake of loud quotes, but for the sake of a calm reference. The city had banned what could not be insured, because it was not a risk but a trauma. During this period, the next, third twist, prepared by the very logic of money, came to light. An inventory of the office brought to light reinsurance agreements, dry promissory note agreements with money changers from neighboring cities. The sheets showed that the broker distributed the risk among several tables, but in a special way. The agreements covered only small consolation amounts and were terminated at the first request for full payment. This meant one simple thing, which sent a chill through even the markets. The office was economically structured for failure. Full payment threatened to cause a cash flow gap at several houses at once, and therefore the mechanics were deliberately set up for eternal, unproven events. The clerk put these papers in a file next to the rejection tables and realized that the legend of modern financial protection of honor actually covered up an old strategy, collecting contributions under the guise of care, but keeping the cash register locked with conditions that never allowed a real insurance event to occur. While the audit was underway, the guards brought copies of the night logs to the office. In them, they found entries featuring the very same circle of experts who had previously been allowed to conduct raids under the plausible pretext of strengthening order. Now the books were marked in red. The participation of these individuals was terminated, and any moral inspections outside of medical indications were classified as abuse of authority. This amendment seemed dry, but it cut off the main channel feeding the myth. It was no longer possible to obtain a dubious piece of paper at night and then insert it as an argument in a daytime refusal. The city seemed to be closing the hatch through which the trade in other people's pain went down to the basement and returned to the square with a purified formulation. Meanwhile, the broker untangled the remains of the network. He offered several houses settlement consultations, assuring them that his people's experience would help them avoid court. New vocabulary appeared on business desks: reputation advice, family conflict risk assessment, expectation management. In words, everything looked innocent, but in reality the schemes remained the same, only without the loud word insurance. The city lawyer insisted on expanding the decree to ban not the word, but the construct, where an event cannot be verified without violating medical statutes, without humiliation, or is determined by the conclusions of persons dependent on the seller. It sounded like dry technique, but it is precisely technique that closes the loopholes through which the most common abuses pass. The atmosphere in shops and workshops was changing. Women discussed not insurance policies, but updated marriage contracts, where instead of shame, there were wardrobes, fabrics, and deadlines. Knife makers argued about steel prices and laughed that it had become more useful for people to buy things rather than paper peace. There were fewer strange visits from adult relatives demanding special procedures in the bathhouses. Midwives returned to their craft without awkward scenes. Surgeons no longer heard insistent requests to secure the exit, just in case. What seemed like part of urban life just a week ago became recognized as an excessive and dangerous practice, pushed out of the law. Meanwhile, in the office, The remaining inventory was being sorted through. Among the stacks of forms were prepared witness forms with empty cells waiting to be filled in with appropriate names. The clerk noted how cleverly the office saved on independence. It was enough to have sets of almost ready-made phrases that could be substituted for any story. Among the papers were also arbitration decision templates prepared in advance, with spaces for names and amounts, but with the invariable wording about incomplete evidence. This was not the language of a court, but of a machine. The guild elders of the clerks, seeing these templates, frowned. Their craft was being turned into a factory of fog, where every line was created not for clarity, but to divert attention. Attempts to appeal to higher authorities began. The broker sent petitions to the district office, citing the right of houses to enter into private agreements without interference from the city, unless there was clear illegality. He attached letters of recommendation from people who owed him money and promised that in the future he would more strictly monitor the independence of experts. The clerk and the lawyer sent their own package to the same address. Guild statutes, excerpts from imperial police decrees of former rulers, an analysis of correspondence on reinsurance, tables of refusals, and a calculation of the economic impracticality of the myth, when the costs of city settlements exceed the stamp duty revenue. The district office responded a few weeks later, and its response was typically restrained. The city is acting within its authority. The ban on contracts whose enforcement requires violations of statutes and causes harm is deemed appropriate, and the broker's complaint is dismissed. This document put a lid on the matter, shielding the city's decision from attempts to once again stir up confusion in the corridors of power. This was followed by a period of aftermath, always dangerous because vacuums cannot be tolerated. Insurance sheets were replaced by brochures on sensible drafting of marriage contracts. Some of them contained traces of the old logic, seemingly innocent advice on how to protect your new family from rumors and preempt envious people with agreements. The scribe proposed a simple outline to the Scribes' Guild, a set of acceptable clauses on property issues, and a ban on any wording that referred to reputational damage as an event determined by the advice of unknown people. A discussion arose within the guild, but the workshops, which had to feed their apprentices, quickly realized that reading clear rules caused fewer problems than easy money for a vague phrase, which would later result in guards and clerks knocking on their doors. While the city was consolidating the new norm, two old cases surfaced that showed how deeply the myth had penetrated. In one marriage contract, a hidden clause was discovered, drawn up in circumvention of the notarial model. The groom's family undertook to pay a sum in the event of a disgraceful outcome, subject to the conclusion of a council of experts. In another, the bride's family signed a receipt for a fine in favor of the groom's family for breach of trust, as certified by knowledgeable people. Both documents were drawn up in the years when the broker's office was gaining momentum, and although they now seemed absurd, At the time, they were signed in earnest, framed by pious words. The magistrate declared these clauses null and void as contrary to the new policy and the old statutes, and ordered explanations to be sent to the parishes, so that the priests could stop those who wanted to repeat the old mistake in a new form. People's lives reflected the changes. In homes where the sheet had previously lain next to the dowry, additional entries appeared in family books. Who contributes what part of the property, how to resolve disputes, when and where to seek mediation. It became fashionable to have a copy of the city memo, which explained in simple terms what could and could not be insured. Goods, transportation, crops, tools, not reputation, not body, not dignity. In the squares, people argued about whether the city was encroaching too much on the freedom of homes, and in each such dispute, sooner or later, someone else's story would surface about how certification turned into pain and consolation payments did not console anyone. Thus, public discourse regained its key word, a measure that had previously been easily leased to those who confidently drew lines in the air. Meanwhile, in the broker's office, both the walls and the arguments wore thin. Clients left, trustees disappeared, and experts, drowning in their addictions, tried not to remember those nights when their signatures turned someone else's house into a counting chamber of fog. Some tried to find work in the guilds, but there they required oaths and clean records. Others moved to neighboring cities where the obvious had not yet been spoken aloud. The clerk did not follow their fate. He had enough current affairs on his desk. The usual lawsuits, taxes, purchasing firewood for the city's furnaces. Inside, however, there remained a quiet confidence that the main work had been done, not at the moment of the resonant decree, but where paper had closed loopholes, where statutes had reinforced a silently accepted truth, where the guards had ceased to be night notaries for the markets of fear. To maintain the line, the city came up with a simple institution, a mediation room at the magistrate's office. There, adult parties could discuss property and family disputes with the participation of recognized mediators, under protocol and without humiliating practices. The room looked boring: a table, 3 benches, pens, ink, a seal. But boredom is often the best response to a market that feeds on sensationalism and fog. In a few months, dozens of domestic conflicts passed through this room. In some, specific property concessions were agreed upon. In others, the terms of separate living arrangements were agreed upon, with a subsequent meeting at the consistory. In others, it was simply recorded that after the wedding, each party would assume certain household expenses. Not once was it necessary to mention those bodies and that dubious evidence that had previously been brandished in kitchens and basement bathhouses. Further on the horizon was the season when caravans carrying news from afar entered the city. In one shipment of barrels of wine and sacks of saffron came leaflets from neighboring cities. Some raved about new ways of managing family risks, while others told of high-profile cases against slanderers. The scribe noted that the language there was as elastic as it once was in their own city. Every word moved between the promise of peace and the threat of judgment, between morality and the market. He put the letters in a folder for comparison and realized that the city would never be alone in its experience. Somewhere the myth was still strong. Somewhere the document was already stronger than habit. It was important not to fall asleep and not to allow subtle wording to creep back into notarial templates. When the final reports on the returns were submitted to the Treasury, the last figure, written out in words, sounded like a calm note. So many sums had been returned, office expenses and stamp duty had been deducted, cash balances had been closed, expert councils had been disbanded, and bathhouse registers had been cleared. The treasurer, a dry and precise man, allowed himself an unprofessional remark for the first time, a note in the margins that the costs of medical and security interventions during the years of paper defense of honor cost the city more than the construction of a new water supply artery, which meant that the savings from the ban were not only in morality, but also in wood, stone, and iron. This calculation closed the cycle. The market, which pretended to care, turned out to be simply an expensive machine for processing fear into insignificant, comforting crumbs and long bills for someone else's pain. These days the clerk thought a lot about how to preserve memory without thirsting for blood. His craft did not know loud tribunes, and therefore a small set of practices with a clear title was laid on the table. A memo for houses and notaries about contracts that are permissible and those that are impermissible by nature. The first half listed things that could be insured: the transportation of goods, the risk of losing tools, the danger of fire in a warehouse, crop failure on a specific plot of land. The second half listed things that could not and should not even be attempted to be converted into a sum of money: honor, body, dignity, reputational costs. Opposite each item was not a sermon, but a reference to the charter, a rule, a magistrate's decision, or an explanation from the consistory. This sheet hung in the guildhouse of scribes next to the prices of paper and quills, and every apprentice saw how boring words added up to real peace, more durable than the promise of supposedly clever paper covering a rewritten and politely worded refusal. The city became a little quieter. It was not the silence of myth, viscous and bought. It was a silence like the clear water in a fountain, when no spices are added to it for the sake of piety. People still argued and took offense. Marriages were made and broken, but now fewer hands reached for the seal, promising to redeem shame. Adult women more often came for advice to the guild elders and the mediation room rather than to the nighttime experts. Men, accustomed to resolving issues through foggy paperwork, learned to count things. Among the guards, freed from strange observations at night, there was less temptation to earn extra money with special services. and in the bathhouses, where passion for someone else's righteousness had previously caused a commotion, the usual steam returned, silent and honest. And yet the city had no illusions. The clerk left a list of 2 more vulnerabilities on the table: agreements on impeccable behavior of servants, with fines for rumors and sworn receipts in workshops, where young apprentices were forced to make promises that could not be verified, except through humiliation and fear. He knew that sooner or later, someone's clever mind would come along and offer new packaging for old goods. But now the city had a vaccine, a simple phrase that could be relied on in any corridor. Do not ensure what cannot be confirmed without harm, without violations of the Charter, and without independent people. Do not put a price on what ceases to be a virtue as soon as it is measured in coins. By evening, when the candles were extinguished again in the town hall, the clerk lingered at the office window. In the square, boys, no longer boys, but young men, carried barrels. Shopkeepers closed their shutters, and apprentices led away their masters' dogs. Life was returning to its usual rhythm, where there was no place for loud proclamations. And yet, in this ordinariness, there was a slight shift, like after a bell had been repaired. The sound became clearer. The myth of financial protection, for that which by its nature cannot be insured, receded, and a document, dull and rigid, took its place. The city, where paper no longer traded in pain, did not become holy. It became practical. And practicality, as the old people here knew, is stronger than any legend, because it outlives the moneylender, the broker, and even the memory of them, leaving only neat lines in the registers about how people once decided that dignity is not a commodity or a bet, but a condition without which no contract is worth the ink. In the weeks that followed, the city learned to live with the new norm as if it had always existed, and only a few seams betrayed the freshness of the stitches. An announcement from the consistory hung on the cemetery gates about the inadmissibility of investigations of morals under the guise of piety. Updated memos for marriage notaries lay in the homes of guild elders. In the guard logs, opposite the former circle of night experts, there was a dry note about the deprivation of access. The tone of conversation in shops and markets changed from anxious and defensive to businesslike. Somewhere people were arguing about the price of salt. Somewhere else they were disputing the quality of cloth. And these disputes were less likely to be infiltrated by that sticky topic that had previously turned any family matter into an exchange of threats and vague inquiries. Letters from neighboring cities, full of elastic phrases about reputational risks, were now read like someone else's advertising leaflet. Eyes skimmed over them, but hands did not reach for wallets. The clerk, accustomed to the fact that paper always catches up with life and never keeps up with it, continued to drive wedges into those places where the myth could take root in a new form. Sample forms were checked again, now not only for defects, but also for students. In some workshops, apprentices were tried to be bound to a good behavior fee, a fine for rumors, or damage to the workshop's honor. The scheme was old, only transferred to the workshops. The event was determined by the mood of the crowd and the agreement of the Council of Respected People, where respectability arose from proximity to the bench. The magistrate did not wait for high-profile cases. Another clause was issued, as dry and terse as the previous ones, which explicitly stated that fines for invalid conditions were negligible and that reservations requiring confirmation from dependent persons were not applicable. At first glance, it was routine bureaucracy, but it was precisely this that stitched the fabric of the city together, so that old goods could not return under a new label. Meanwhile, the broker's office was living out its last days, and this decay clearly revealed the economic logic of the myth. Stacks of forms with empty witness testimony fields lay scattered on the tables. Wax seals, whose impressions had given clients a sense of security just yesterday, gathered dust in the cabinets. Bundles of promissory notes lay in the corners, arranged in such a way that any serious claim would turn the network of guarantees into fragile lace. Several people from the circle of former experts asked the guild elders for an audience, offered to give up their stamps and books in exchange for the right to start with a clean slate, and swore to renounce dubious practices. The appeals were recorded and considered without haste. The city was accustomed to the fact that guilt sometimes goes hand in hand with the desire to maintain one's position. Some had the patience to go through a probationary period and apprenticeship with a master, while others did not. Those who did not endure left for neighboring cities, and this posed the risk of a new wave. Foreign markets love what takes money out of fear, and they love even more to be the first after someone else's ban. A new point of tension was a letter that came from the district office with a seal reminiscent of higher authorities and distant pockets. In addition to acknowledging the city's decision, it contained a reminder of the old imperial police regulations from the time of previous rulers, which, under the guise of combating gambling, described transactions in case of shame and disgrace. These lines, official and dry, went down in history like stones in a bridge. Previously, they had been used to cover up individual slips of paper and wild bets, but now they served as the basis for a whole rule that removed hidden trade in human dignity from contracts. In itself, this did not add drama to anyone's personal fate, but it balanced the city's argument. It was not a single clerk with tables who decided, but a line of law that stretched across several decades and held, like a strong rope, the gap between justice and the market of pain. The financial side of the case seemed to be closed, but the Treasury found another mess that needed cleaning up. Stamp duties on dubious documents disappeared, but hidden expenses from previous years came to light. Payments to guards for extra night patrols, payments to clerks for partitions, for extra paper, for storing complaints that were never followed up on. The figures added up to a sad bill. The city did not earn money. The city paid for an illusion and remained silent because the illusion seemed like a moral shield. After the audit, the treasurer, a man who did not like grand words, proposed a simple measure: to use the freed-up money to repair street wells and water gutters. This measure did not look like a symbol,
but like a cure for the cause. When the city has cleaner water and better sewers, there is less room for sermons, where fear replaces sanitary logic, and less demand for paper that promises protection from foreign languages. While masons were laying new slabs at water intakes, cases similar to those that had previously been attempted to be resolved through policies of honor began to appear in the mediation room. In one case, two adult families argued over the fate of part of the dowry. In another, over the timing of the bride's move to the groom's house. In the third, over the share of income from a shop that was to come under common ownership. None of these issues required humiliating examinations, and this in itself was reflected in the city as a new habit, counting things instead of counting scars.
Several times, old scraps of paper were brought into the room, the very same comforting statements that had been stamped by the broker's office yesterday. Now they were being returned to the office to be filed away, as a reminder of how this series of decisions had begun. Where the paper receded, the familiar shadows appeared. Illegal reputation councils emerged in the suburbs, small circles of people who promised to reconcile families for a fee and offered the same dubious methods. They were found quickly. The smell of easy money always attracts the same people. The guards, no longer acting as night notaries, this time did not take their usual pleasure in interfering in other people's homes. They came, took the lists, brought them to the office, where everything was placed on a shelf marked suppressed. Suburban residents were warned that any council that recognized events outside the consistorial and judicial rules had no power, and that charging money for such services was considered abuse. On this wave, they showed that the city was capable not only of prohibiting, but also of protecting, where new ribs of the old structure arose. Neighboring cities reacted in their own way. One sent a letter praising the flexibility of the local market for family agreements, which clearly explained how arbitration councils can soften the blows of fate. Another sent a brochure with a story about the saved reputation of a certain house, where everything was resolved through a smart contract. In both cases, the myth clearly stood out above the document. The absence of names and amounts, references to knowledgeable people, an emphasis on the usefulness of fog in the absence of support. The clerk filed these sheets in his thick collection of external samples, like a hunter pinning the skins of animals that no longer live in this forest to the wall. These papers did not circulate around the city. Shopkeepers learned to hear the difference, like the difference between a ringing coin and an empty copper plate. At one point, when it seemed that everything had already been finalized, a case surfaced that resembled a residual mine. Several years ago, one family, having spent a large sum on contributions, received a letter of refusal from the broker's office, but was appeased by a consolation payment, which was enough for a few pieces of fabric and a couple of patches on the roof. Now, with the announced return of contributions, the family appeared at the office with a demand to also take into account the moral damage for years of anxiety. The demand was not based on the law, but on experience, and the city could not pretend not to hear it. The clerk proposed a procedure that was rare for the office: to resolve the issue through a public explanation of the mechanics of the case, how the contributions were collected, where the stamp duties went, what the city budget was spent on, because of the honor policies, and what exactly was being returned and why. This explanation was posted at the town hall and in the parishes. In essence, it was a one-page textbook, read by those who could read and retold at home by those who did not like to read. The family accepted the refund of their contributions and left without further ado. Sometimes an explanation is more effective than attempting to present a special case as a new norm. The shift in habits became noticeable in small ways. In dowry chests, instead of stamped sheets, there were notes with lists of items and amounts. When buying fabrics, reservations were made about quality and delivery times rather than about saving face at home. At city festivals, conversations about other people's bedrooms and witness assessments were less likely to accompany mugs of wine. Of course, the city did not become flawless. Curiosity about other people's bodies and misfortunes does not disappear with decrees. But now this curiosity had fewer legal channels through which it could assert itself, which meant that each subsequent temptation would be more expensive and more noticeable. Where the law takes a pause, the market will inevitably step in. But now there are fewer pauses. An example from another side of city life only reinforced this line of thinking. That autumn, when the wind carried smoke from the smithies through the narrow streets, rumors of disease began to spread in one of the neighborhoods. Questions were sent to the consistory. Could merry gatherings at the baths be banned? Could the watering hole be replaced with holy water? Could morals be tightened in general, as if the air itself could choose whom to strike? The clerk and the city doctor, both men with patience for the fears of others, posted 2 educational notices side by side about clean water, clean hands, airing out houses, and quarantine yards for visitors. These notes did not contain a single word about ensuring cleanliness, let alone any hint of paid certification. The disease receded not on paper, but through hard work, buckets of water, removed sewage, and the determination not to hide imaginary morality in one's wallet. This became a quiet but vivid example of how documents and craftsmanship are stronger than myth. One pulls out the seams, the other washes the stones, and together they do what no piece of paper, promising to protect honor for a percentage, can do. Among those who once bought honor policies, there were those who did not understand everything at once. One adult woman, a representative of a wealthy family, brought to the mediation room the question of how to protect herself from gossip now. She was offered 3 old remedies, each of which seemed too simple to believe: a clear marriage contract with property clauses, a willingness to go to the consistory with witnesses to the case, not hearsay, and a refusal to engage in any practices whatever they may be called, where the body becomes the subject of examination outside of medical indications. A few weeks later, she returned on a different matter, a dispute over the timing of roof repairs in a shared house. And this break was almost symbolic. Where before the conversation had been about the person, now it was about wood and nails. Thus, the myth left the stage, leaving behind neatly closed accounts. Autumn turned to winter. The damp fog, familiar to those who like to use it to cover up the vagueness of contracts, settled over the city like a blanket. But now, there were fewer traps under the blanket. The guards knew that their job was to keep the streets in order, not to give hope to those who were used to measuring dignity with the eyes of others. The guilds understood that their statutes protected not only their craft, but also their bodies. No humiliation, no pressure, no substitution of treatment with examination. The office operated according to established practice. Every new document promising reputation management was immediately turned to the section on the subject. If the subject could not be verified without harm, then the discussion was closed. And although some homes still kept the old sheets for a long time, just as people keep things that once seemed necessary, no one treated them as a shield anymore. It was just a piece of the past, with a wax seal. A reminder that sometimes laziness and fear of discussion make people buy fog in an expensive frame. The clerk, growing old along with the city, found not only professional, but also human clarity more and more often in those years. He saw how the decision to ban contracts with invalid events had a chain of consequences, some of which were barely noticeable, like the faint light of a winter day. Midwives had fewer requests to make conclusions. Surgeons had fewer cases that were bitter and powerless. Guards had fewer temptations to earn extra money at the expense of someone else's shame. And notaries had more clear contracts where the subject was not a myth. He saw the other side too. A few houses, having lost their usual means of pressure on relatives, gossiped more quietly, but they still gossiped. And the law does not provide an instant cure for this habit. And yet the overall picture has shifted. Where people used to talk about honor saved with money, now they talk about things, deadlines, and responsibility. On the eve of the holidays, when fir trees and bundles of candles were being dragged through the narrow streets, a letter arrived at the office from a distant city, where the trade in honor insurance was just gaining momentum. The letter asked for advice, listed difficulties, mentioned resistance from homeowners, and talked about the deafening support of the consistory. The clerk replied without embellishment. He attached a set of resolutions, excerpts from statutes, treasury calculations, and brief notes about the mediation room. Not a single grand word, not a single heroic legend, just the bricks from which a bridge is built. He knew that legends live longer than documents, in the sense that they are told more willingly. But bridges last longer than fairy tales because they can bear the weight of people, carts, strangers, and their own. That evening, he walked past the town hall and paused at the window through which he had once watched
the queue forming to collect their contributions. Now it was empty. On the tables lay the usual business, disputes about warehouses, debts, the theft of a sack of salt. This emptiness was more precious than any holiday.
It meant that other people's pain was no longer formalized with a stamp and handed over to intermediaries with soft hands and quick pens. The city became kind not because of words, but because of its refusal to sell what cannot be bought. And in this simple, difficult truth lay the main protection, not from shame, not from slander, not from evil tongues, but from the very temptation to measure dignity, where the only thing worthy is not to turn it into a commodity. Thus history entered its final circle, where heroes do not receive laurels and institutions receive a little more trust. The myth did not disappear. It simply retreated to the outskirts, where there is always the temptation to call trade a concern. The document took its place, tedious, pedantic, without poetry. But it was this document that allowed adults to stop choosing between humiliation and empty hope. And it was this document that connected one house to another, not through a pledge of honor, but through a clear object and order. There was still one more task left to do, to close those small windows through which habit still tried to peek into the notarial books, and to show that every draft had a simple reason. The doors were not closed properly, and the sky was not to blame.